So with no further ado, it is my joy and my privilege and pleasure to introduce you to Margaret Feinberg.
I think we'll be okay. Thank you. I wanted to begin this morning and share just a little bit of my own story because I think that there are some parallels between things in my own life and some of the challenges within this generation. And as some of you may know, I come from a little bit of an unusual background in that I was raised by a Jewish father who came to recognize Yeshua as the Messiah and a Gentile mother. And so I was raised in a Christian home with hues of Judaism, and at the end of the day, I make a pretty great bowl of matzo ball soup. While growing up, I attended public school, Christian school, private school, and I was homeschooled, and I still think I'm recovering. I just don't know from which one. When I graduated from high school, I was one of those really ambitious ones. And more than anything, I wanted to go to a private university in Washington, D.C. and study pre-law and international relations. And it was a fabulous plan, except for one little problem. I didn't get in. And instead, I ended up in a small liberal arts school right here in North Carolina, where during my freshman year, I engaged in an extracurricular activity better known as partying like a rock star. And while I managed to get the A's on my transcript, I got the B's in life, namely the boys, the beer, and the Ben and Jerry's. But I had a praying mama. And as we all know, praying mamas and praying grandmamas are some of the most powerful people on the planet. And at the end of that freshman year, I remember my youth pastor called and he said, "Margaret, I have a conference that I really think that you need to go to." And so I did. And while I was there, it was like God grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and he said, "You are my child and I have called you by name. Come back to me." And I began turning my life around and spending so much time studying the scripture that I actually became a religion major. Now flash forward 4 years and I am now a religion major focusing on New Testament studies at a small liberal arts school in North Carolina. And people are asking me, "What are you going to do with that?" And I had no idea. Because for any of you or your children who have been sociology majors, communication majors, political science majors, there's this question of what are you going to do after graduation? And I had no idea. So I began throwing applications out in all directions. And the one that stuck was to intern at a small Christian magazine in Lake Mary, Florida. I packed up, I went down, and I spent the summer where I learned two very important things about my life. Number one, that I loved writing, and number two, that I was not built for a cubicle. So at the end of that summer, I remember there weren't really any job opportunities, and my mom called, and she said, "Margaret, your dad and I are going on a mission trip to Tegucigalpa, Honduras. Would you like to go?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." And then she said the magic words, "We'll pay." And I was so there. So I packed up and I went down to Honduras for a week, and I thought maybe this is what God has for my life. Because growing up in the church, it was often when the missionaries came in that they told the amazing stories of what God was doing. And so I thought, if they love God, and this is how they serve God, and I love God, this is maybe how I'm supposed to serve God. And unfortunately, I had several of the worst months of my life. I remember shortly after I was there, I caught a little bug named amoeba. And if you've ever gone to Mexico and had your vacation turn sour, you know what I'm talking about. And I realized that you do not get a whole lot of ministry done when you are hanging out with John. Are we tracking? If that was not enough, my español es terrible. And if that was not enough, I remember one day I was riding at the back of a bus and I had all of my things, and a man came up to me with a knife blade. He held it at my neck and he said, "Give me everything you have," in Spanish. And strangely, I understood him. And so I am sitting there, and I remember I had a half-drunk water bottle, and I'm trying to defend myself when all of a sudden the words of my father flashed through my mind, and he says, if you're ever getting robbed, give them what they want because it's never worth it. And so I'm sitting there going, no, okay, here you go. And now I am in Honduras. I have $87, a passport, and a very upset stomach. And I go to some of the longtime missionaries, and I tell them about my stories and my challenges, and I ask them, is this normal? Because sometimes when we step out in those things that God has for us, we encounter adversity. And so I said, is this how it's supposed to be? Is this part of what's happened to you? And they looked at me and they said, no, go home. And so about 10 months after my college graduation, I ended up doing what most college graduates do, and I moved back in with mom and dad. And in fact, a recent Monster.com survey found that 60% of college graduates plan to move back in with their parents after graduation. That is why they have dubbed us the boomerang generation. You send us out, and we come back. Which means that for some of you who are thinking about turning that bedroom into your own library or study or art room as your child goes out to college, can I encourage you not to, because it will save you a whole lot of money. And so I am living with my parents, and I am thinking, God, what am I supposed to do with my life? Like so many others are asking. And as I'm praying and I'm crying out to God, I honestly did not hear a peep. And that is when I decided to turn the question around and ask myself, if I could do anything with my life and time and money were not factors, what would I want to do? In other words, if all jobs on the planet, from the very highest to the very lowest, all paid $10 an hour, what would I want to do? And as I thought and as I prayed, I only had one answer. I wanted to write. In fact, I wanted to write more than I wanted to eat, which is a really good thing because most writers grow up to be starving artists. And so I took those clips from that summer internship. I wrote a half a dozen Christian magazines, and I said, hi, my name is Margaret Feinberg, and you have never heard of me. But could I write the reviews in the back of your magazine? Because I knew that if I could win an editor's confidence with that smallest publishable piece, that I could work my way up. And slowly I did, from reviews to news stories to feature stories to cover stories, and eventually into books. And so over the last dozen years or so, I have had the privilege of sharing the story not only of what God has been doing in my life, but what He's been doing in my generation and in communities around the world. Well, one of the first books that I ever wrote was on a topic that was near and dear to my heart. And that was my generation. Because in my early 20s, as I'm trying to sort through all these questions of vocation and personal relationship with God and what I'm supposed to do with my life and how I can honor and glorify Him, I'm going to my local Christian bookstore and I can't hardly find anything that is available. And so I started to wonder, well, what would it look like to write that kind of book? And so my desire to publish and go in this kind of direction resulted in the book 20-something Surviving and Thriving in the Real World. But as I began writing that book, I wanted to do research and try to find statistics and facts that kind of backed up some of what I was seeing among my friends. And what I discovered pretty early on in that project was that it was really hard to find statistics on my generation. And I started to ask the question why, and here is what I discovered. And that is, if you want to know what is going on in a teenager's life, where do you go? To the local high school. If you want to know what's going on in somebody, say, of a senior age's life, where do you go? AARP. If you want to find out what's going on in the life of a new mom, where do you go? To the hospitals. If you want to find out what's going on in the life of a college student, where do you go? To the colleges. But if you want to find out what's going on in somebody's life between the ages of 22 and 28, where do you go? they're a whole lot more difficult in order to track down. And so what I discovered was finding the statistics and the research and the trends in a numerical formula that kind of explored this generation was really hard to do. And so when I would find one of those statistics or one of those insights, I would hold on to them and treasure them. Well, the problem is I wrote this book a number of years ago, but because I realized that the information was so valuable, I just kept collecting it whenever I came upon it. And so this morning, what I wanted to do was just share a handful of things that I have discovered in my research of this generation that I believe will help empower you as a mission in order to reach out to the next generation. And one of the first things that I discovered was a rather small statistic that came from the U.S. Census Bureau. And it simply said this: since 1970, the average age of marriage for someone has shifted, particularly from women, from the ages of 20 to 24, and for men from the ages of 22 to 27. Now that's one little statistic, but it has huge implications. Let's go over here. A while back, I was reading an article in U.S. News and World Report about the gardening industry. And in this article, it had a small statistic that said that since 1970, the average size of a home being built in the United States has grown from 1,500 square feet to 2,340 square feet. Has anybody in here noticed that the size of houses being built in the United States is getting bigger? Can anybody say McMansion? And what the article pointed out was that just as the size of houses is getting bigger, the size of lots is actually getting smaller. And this is having a tremendous impact on the gardening industry because suddenly people don't have the amount of space that they once did to garden. The types of plants they're using, the types of machinery that they need, the types of tools that they need in order to garden are shifting rather quickly. Well, as I was reading this article, I began to think that the fact that houses are getting bigger is not just affecting the gardening industry, it's also affecting the environment. Because we all know that when you build a bigger house, it requires more resources, and in order to keep the house warm or cool, it also requires additional resources. And so this is having a tremendous impact on the environment. But what I realized is it's not just affecting the environment, it's also affecting families financially. Because some of you may have noticed, but when you buy a bigger house, you get a bigger mortgage. And so often, in today's families, it's not just one member of the household who's going out to work, but it's actually both parents in a household. And so this is having huge economic repercussions on the local family. But then I began to realize that it's not just the family that it's affecting financially, it's also affecting the very social fabric of our nation. Because in a 1,500 square foot house, the kind of house that I grew up with, there's just not that many places to go. Like maybe you have a living room and a den and a couple of bedrooms. And in that small area, families just live life together. They can't get away from each other. But when you live in a 3 or a 4 or a 5,000 square foot home, it's like all of a sudden the daughter has the east wing and the son has the west wing and the parents are in the back room bungalow. And that natural organic thing that just happens when families just live life together, you have to be a whole lot more intentional in order to make it happen. So one little statistic, people today are building bigger houses, huge implications.